Well, good evening, and welcome to a kind of question-based stream tonight from Stars. So, in tonight's stream, instead of about computers or technology, it's this one is about this one's got some car questions. So, first of all, we're going to start out with there's one viewer that emailed it, and honestly, it's a great question. As far as fancy exotic cars, definitely Ferraris are out of the picture, and Maseratis, and some of those other very expensive sport cars. I'm not really into luxurious cars like that. The only thing exotic I would ever go and test drive is probably either Mercedes Benz or Jaguars or Lexuses or maybe Audis or Volvos or something to that extreme, or Hondas or Toyotas or Kias or Hyundais or something to that extent. But the only car that is kind of fun to drive, even though it's a real money pit, that's very expensive, but I'm not talking even cost at this point in time. The the physical car value isn't really there anymore because they don't want it anymore. It's called Jaguar S Type. You can pick one up cheap for around probably 5-6 grand. That it's got high mileage, and what I mean by costing a lot of money is more more expensive a car, more luxurious, to more bells and whistles and sensors and electronics and computers and stuff. The more stuff that go wrong. Like a Jaguar, like an S Type, for instance. If you find one for sale somewhere, chances are it's going to need a new transmission, or you might need new computers for it, or computer boards, or it depends on the car and what condition. Would I recommend buying one as a daily driver? No. They are fun to drive, especially the V8. They made 3 different trim levels. I believe they had the V6 version. Definitely stay away from the V6 version. It's very. There's a guy I knew. That was about maybe a year or so back. I had class with him, and he was an auto mechanic, and he was telling me that those Jaguar S Type with the V6 in there is a real horror story to work on. And he said there's always stuff breaking on the engines, and he says if you're gonna buy one, he says buy the V8. They had the 4-liter V8, and they had the 4.2. They're really neat looking cars, and they really ride nice, and they're fun to drive in that. But honestly, I think you could do better as far as a daily driver for a car than a Jaguar. If you want it for a weekend car or something, that's that's fine, or a Sunday car, or going church car or something. But I wouldn't recommend using one of those as a daily driver. And another luxury car then that's very fun to drive is an Infiniti. And I do like Infinitis, but I do actually happen to personally own one myself. I bought one of those i30s back in 2015, and actually, to be completely honest, the car is actually a money pit. And Because every time you turn around, either you got check engine lights that come on or error codes that come up. But I only drive that as a weekend car, and so it doesn't matter that much. I dumped about $5,000 into it since owning it. But after about $5,000 worth of work being done to it, what really screwed up that car was letting college students work on it. I wasn't the one that let the college students work on it. It was the previous owner of it. Then they really did a dang up job on there. They hooked the swirl valve up backwards. They hooked the solenoid speed control up backwards. They hooked up. I'm surprised they didn't destroy the entire engine or destroy the entire car. Excuse me. It's just you don't let college kids work on a luxury car like that. That's I know it'll change fine, but now when you're having see what happened with that car was when you started up, sometimes the idle was so low that you couldn't keep the car going. And if you sat at a stoplight, it would actually didn't stall. Which I kind of thought there was a vacuum leak. And that wasn't the case. That was either that or possibly I thought it was catalytic converter or but basically it was actually and it wasn't the swirl valve either. I've been about $900 to get that replaced because the swirl valve was basically at the bottom of the engine. You have to lift the engine out of the car in order to get to the swirl valve. So if you could do it yourself, that's great. But one, I wouldn't have been able to do that myself because I don't have a engine hoist, and you got to have the proper garage to do it in. Sure, I got a 2-car garage, but it's not really set up for doing that kind of work. It's kind of cramped in there, so. And on top of that, I'm not really that car or mechanically inclined to actually take on a project like that. If I wanted to change the oil on it, I could. Or if I wanted to change the spark plugs, I could do that. But to physically rip a motor out of the car and change the swirl valve and put it back in and get it everything hooked up, I wouldn't be comfortable doing that. So, and you will pay an arm and a leg to get something like that done. But in my case, luckily, it was just a solenoid speed control. And that was actually an easier fix. And that's probably something I could have done myself. Because it was in an easier location of the engine instead of on the physical bottom side of it. But the problem with solenoid speed control is when it malfunctions, either your revolutionary per minute is so low that, or it's so high that when you take off from a stoplight, you could actually burn rubber, not intentionally, but just accidentally. So, or sometimes your car is idling and it's revving between like 22 and 2400 RPMs. But there are still quirks with that car yet. I'll admit that. Because sometimes once you reach between 22 and 2600 RPMs, between when it's shifting from the second shift point to the third shift point, it'll rev up, and then you hear. I'm almost thinking there's probably a problem with the transmission on there, but for just as a Sunday car, I'm not really going to do anything about it. I don't commute around. I don't go down to Milwaukee or anything with it, or go through Appleton or Oshkosh with it, but or drive up to Door County with it for work, or use it to haul stuff or put stuff, or use it as a work vehicle. I did for a while. I've traveled around with it when I first got it. There's times I hauled ladders in it. There's times I hauled a lawnmower home with it one time. Not a ride or anything, just a push more in the back of the trunk. And then there's times I hauled some lumber around with it. But it's the thing I like about it is it got the V6 3.0-liter engine in there. So it had plenty of power. If I wanted to even put a trailer hitch on there, I'd put like a class 1 trailer hitch on there, and you could totally get 2,000-pound trailer around. So, and you could even haul a pop-up camper with it if you wanted to. It'd have plenty of power for that. But I don't go camping anymore. I have no desire to camp anymore. You get kind of burned after a while. So, like, if I was going to buy a camper, I got a van. So I'd use the van instead of that car. So, as far as my recommendations for an Infiniti, a lot of them are fun to test drive. Sometimes I get bored. Sometimes I'll go down to a dealership and test drive some of them. Not the brand new models. I only do used or used models. I did the i30 I drive on occasion, but I'd have to say one of my favorites is like the M35 and the QX60. And then I can't remember the other model, but they're fun to drive. And even I have to admit, I even like their SUVs. I think for being an Infiniti guy, I should know everything about every model and every make, but it's hard to keep track of all that stuff. I admit that. But now, as far as like Lexuses, they can actually be fairly decent vehicles, from what I was told by other people. Like the ES300, I see a lot of those on the road yet, and people tell me that they're fairly trouble free. Some of those earlier ones and I admit myself, I've driven one, and actually it feels like a solid. It doesn't feel cheap and chintzy on the inside. Some of those luxury cars out there, some of them just feel chintzy, in my opinion. It's just cheap plastic interior with cheap feeling knobs and controls, and it's a lot of the new Cadillacs feel like that, in my opinion, and a lot of the new Buicks feel like that. But we'll get to that portion of it later. But for now, we'll finish up with. So as far as like the Lexuses, they can be decent vehicles for the most part. Lexus is part of Toyota. Toyota is more or less what more people buy than Lex, but some of those Lexuses can go for 20, 30 years without any major problems. So that's a plus. Would I buy one? Yes and no. Would I buy one just to have sitting around? And probably not. But would I buy a new one? No, I don't think I would, because they're kind of expensive. Mine, but they can be decent vehicles, quality wise. They don't feel cheap on the inside. They got decent seats in them. They got decent, the controls and stuff feel decent. And even if you buy an older one and you want to make it feel like it's got all that smart, like digital radios, and you can buy an Android based radio and put it in there and make it feel modern. And you can even put a camera on the back if that fancies. So there's stuff out there, but usually with older cars, I don't like to deface them. In that way, I always like to keep the OEM radios and OEM speakers and OEM knobs and stuff. I don't like to modify it and make it something that it isn't. So we're gonna move on. So as far as even like what brand am I thinking of? As far as Mercedes-Benz, they're fun to drive, but they're in the United States, they're money pits. In Europe, they're probably a lot better built and less problems. But in the United States, I wouldn't waste a dime on one, even though they are fun to drive, and you feel kind of swanky when you're behind the wheel. And I'll tell you this: the interior does not feel cheaply put together on those cars. But then again, I don't test drive those. I've only driven one, and that was like in the 80s or 90s. And I can't even remember what model. No, it wasn't a diesel one either. That would have been fun. Even though the response would have been slow, but personally, I wouldn't waste money on cars like that. Well, even Kia makes like the Nati. That's their luxury. The Altima. I wouldn't say it's completely luxury, but it's up there. And even like the K900, now Genesis, is part of Kia's luxury line cars now. And even like the Hyundai years ago, like back in 2002, they've released the Hyundai XG300, XG350. They're little cars, but actually they're kind of fun to drive. It's feel cheap either. So but those cars are notorious for being money pits as far as transmissions and catalytic converters. But then again, a lot of them run up to 180,000 miles trouble free for the most part. And then I'm also familiar with the Hyundai Sonata from 2000s, early 2000s, like 99, 2000, 2001. I had a cousin that had me the keys and told me to have at it. So I took it out for the Santa Fe. I have to say I like the one I had the pleasure of test driving had the 3.6 liter, either 3.6 or 3.5 liter V6. And I would have to say if I was going to buy a vehicle like that, I would get the V6. And people are like, why would you want to do that? And I'm not much of a four-cylinder guy here. Sure, you get good. You don't get any better mileage than you would with a V6. And plus, what's the point of having a vehicle like that if you can't tow anything with it? Well, at least a V6, you can tow at least maybe 2,000, 2,500 pounds or 2,300 pounds or something. So I got my reasons for. But as far as the rest of the models of Hyundai, I'm not really familiar with the rest of them, and that's okay. But as far as like Honda, Honda Accords are nice cars, in my opinion. The only one I've ever driven was a 2001. No, that wasn't 2001. That was a 98. And it was the base model. It only had a 5-speed transmission. I didn't own it. I just kind of test drove it. Or actually, somebody just let me or tossed me the keys. And not many young people know how to drive stick, but for a car like that had, at the time when I did the car, I think it had like around 200 and some thousand miles on it. And for being the base, the most basic car you could buy, or the base package, I thought it was well equipped for not having a V6 engine and automatic transmission. Sure, it's 5-speed, but the car got at least 36 miles a gallon when you get on the interstate. So they got my seal approval there. Plus, they actually ride really nice. And a lot of those cars, they go for a long time. And even the Honda Civics aren't bad either. I still see 80s and 90s Honda Civics on the road, and even the 80s Honda Accords I still see on the road yet. It's a quality vehicle, and they can last a very long time when you do proper maintenance and proper oil changes at the appropriate time. And you keep up with your fluids and stuff and use the correct fluids and not something that you're not supposed to be using. And if you drive it graciously, that also helps in factoring how long the car is going to last. So then, and then the Honda CRV, in my opinion, is the chooser. When I buy a new one, nah, I need to buy like a 90s or 2000, early 2000s one, but I'll buy with low mileage. What's nice is you can fold the seats down and you can haul stuff in there or haul passengers around and stuff like that. But that car doesn't get very high mileage for 4-cylinder. It only gets like maybe 20 miles a gallon, 21, 22, something like that. But as far as the rest of those Honda cars, I'm not really familiar with. But as far as like Toyota, I've haven't really driven a Corolla or anything like that or a Matrix, but I heard those are very decent cars, and they can go. Some of them go to 300,000 miles with trouble free, with minor oil changes and tires and brakes and rotors and stuff like that. But as far as like the Camrys, it's a very spacious car in my opinion. The only one I've ever test driven was a 2000, and I never bought it because I found something different. That was a couple of years back, but I thought the car handled pretty nice, and it wasn't. This one was a fully loaded. It had the fake wood and had the 3 liter V6 and had the leather seats and had the fancy radio and stuff like that. As far as the Toyota SUVs or trucks, I've never actually touched a Toyota truck or an SUV, so I honestly can't tell you how they feel or how they perform, or even the Toyota crossovers. I'm not familiar with any of them, but it is what it is with that. I'm more familiar with the American cars like the Fords, the, the GM's products, and then Mopar, Chrysler, Dodge, Plymouth, Ram, Jeep. Actually, I haven't really driven a Jeep, but the luxury line, Ford doesn't really have a luxury line of cars. But the only thing close to that is I like the Crown Vics. They're gas guzzlers, but they're fun. Fun cars of cruise around in. And even the Ford Taurus, I have to say my favorite years of the Ford Taurus is the 90s, like the station wagon. But actually, they're still decent cars. You can pick like a 2000. You can pick one up for like $1,500 to $2,500. So they're decent, and I'd recommend a Taurus. Sure, they got problems and they got stuff like that, but that's expected of any of those cars. If you can find one cheap enough and it'll last you like 5, 6 years or more, you get your money out of it. The only one I haven't driven was a Fusion, but I've driven several different generations of Ford Focuses, ranging from 2000, like around 2006, 2012, and then 2018. One was a sedan and then one was a hatchback. But the 2000, I'll start with like the 2006 one that I've driven was the trim package on there was the SES. I think the next one up was ST. The SES, you get fog lamps on there, you get the actually CD player on there and stuff like that. But as far as something like that, or a car like that, would I buy that? No. I wouldn't waste money on a Ford Focus from 2006. It's basically a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. And what I mean by that is transmissions are on the weak side on those cars, and they're known that they could break at any time. So don't waste your money on those cars. Usually around the 100,000 mile mark, that's when they're expected to break down and they become a headache. As far as the 2012 year range, they're all right, but I don't have much to say because I didn't really take it that use the car that long or much. But the only one I can say I got a little more experience with is ones from like the 2015 to 2018 year range. The sedan, I did test drive one of those, and personally, it was all right. It's a zippy car. They get like 40 some miles to the gallon. So, but the only thing that I kind of worry is that you got the turbo under or turbocharged, and you could have problems down the road with it. Potentially transmission problems are known, and even engine issues with them. And I had a friend that bought a hatchback, one of those Ford Focus SUs, the hatchback, and he just got rid of it recently because he had so many problems with it. But then again, he had 200,000 miles on there, and before he went and got it fixed for the final time before selling it, he let me take it out for a drive. So I did. And in between every shift point, that transmission on there would just clunk, something terrible. And the whole car would just kind of jerk between shift points, and it didn't even sound like it was grinding gears, which was kind of scary, in my opinion. I thought, is it going to break down on me? Am I going to get stranded out in the middle of nowhere where nobody's going to come? It can be very nerve wracking when you're riding around in something that could deja vu you. So I like the car. It's just I wouldn't waste money on a Focus. And I think Ford knows that it was a problematic car, so that's why they pulled it out of production, and they don't sell it here in the U.S. anymore because of how many problems. And everybody's getting away from compact cars, and everybody's buying trucks now and SUVs. And vans. That's the big trend. Well, actually, not even minivans so much. There's more crossovers and SUVs. Now, as far as like the only SUV I've ever driven from was a Ford was the Ford Escape. That was one of the 2016 and then one of the 2017. Difference between the 2016 is it has slightly different tail lenses and body design compared to the 2017. Honestly, I like the look of the 2016 better, in my opinion, than the 2017. But that's just me. But I like the looks of the 2020 Ford Escapes that just came out this last year. One thing I like about the car is it looks small on the outside, but when you get on the inside, the cabin is very roomy, seats are comfortable, controls easy access, and the car actually handles quite well on bumpy roads and going around town or on the interstate. And those cars are actually built on a Focus frame. But the funny thing is, those cars, they don't have half the problems that the Ford Focuses did. So, would I actually buy one? Yes, I would actually buy a car like that. But I wouldn't buy it with the all-wheel drive. I'd only buy it with the front-wheel drive. And the reason I say that is that it's less likely for something to go haywire. And if you think about it, you don't really need a four-wheel drive vehicle in Wisconsin, not in winter. You just drive more carefully. Instead of racing through the snow, you take your time like everybody else with front-wheel drive vehicles or rear-wheel drive vehicles that don't have four-wheel drive in that. But As far as like the trucks, like the Rangers, and the only Ranger I've ever driven was a '90s Ranger, and handles all right. But would I recommend them? I don't care for knowing the fact that you could go up a hill or something, and all of a sudden your car dies on you, or truck rather. I'm more like an F-150 guy or an F-250. As far as F-150s, the only ones I've ever touched was like an '80s, not a late '80s, but like an early '80s XL regular cab, 8-foot bed truck, which that was just the 5 point. I think that was a 5.0 liter V8. And actually, that was a very solid truck. Sure, you don't have your GPS and navigational system on it, but it's a it's a real truck, in my opinion. No thrills, just a basic AM/FM radio, bench seat, manual crank windows, manual locks. Do I own one? No. Somebody let me borrow it. And you can tow a lot of stuff with that truck. And it handles quite smoothly for a truck like that on the road. Would I buy something like that? Probably, in my opinion. I don't see any problems with it. And then I've also driven a '90s or early '90s version of it. I think it was like '93 or '94. So that somebody borrowed me one time. That was a couple 5 years back. That was like the XLT or something. Still a solid build truck. It The only time that they're difficult starting is when in a cold winter, but they are actually decent trucks in my opinion. And even my uncle had a 1999 XLT as extended cab, but that was not the long bed. That was just the 6.5, and that was a solid truck too. Other than his had a lot of rust on it, but it didn't matter. The only thing that was kind of if I was going to buy a truck, I'd have to have the 5.4 liter Triton instead of the 4.8. 4.8 V8 is too small, in my opinion, for towing. So you're going to buy one from that era, get the 5.4. So as far as anything newer than that, I haven't driven any newer F-150s. But as far as like F-250s, the only ones I've ever touched was one from the '90s with the 7.3 Power Stroke diesel cab, 8-foot bed, truck cab on it. And if you have a straight pipe on there, not with a nasty tip or anything like that, but just like a 3.5 inch down pipe all the way down to the end. That is a sweet sounding truck. And you can almost tow up to 17,000 pounds with that truck. And yes, they are very fun to drive. And yes, they do have problems with the OBS and some of the problems with turbo, and there are problems with it, but where I buy it, oh yeah, it's still classified as a truck in my opinion, a real truck. So this is just part one of the questionnaire will continue. I don't think it's not tomorrow anymore, but probably Monday. We'll finish up the car review. So I think on Monday we'll start out with GM stuff and then work our way to Dodge. We won't wrap it up then. So thank you for tuning in. I tried to explain the stuff the best I could, but there's people out there that are better at explaining cars than. It's not that I'm not good at it. It's just you got to have certain. I don't have the proper terminology down pat, but I do the best I can. So thank you for tuning in. I hope you all have a good rest of your weekend. God bless you all. Stay safe and just keep the faith. And we'll see you very soon.